Paying respect to what came before you should be written in stone and hung around the necks of every single person in this world, as it's only when society forgets its mistakes that it makes them again. The video game industry and media in general needs to learn this, especially seeing as they love trying to pull a reboot every couple of years, and more often than not makes an absolute hash of it. Indeed, the entries on this list took a brilliant concept, a proven concept in fact, and managed to screw the pooch so hard that the RSPCA came busting down the doors. Somehow, even when copying from the perfect formula, time and time again video game developers have scribbled all over the place. So let's gather round and take a look at greed, laziness, and a whole lack of respect. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 7 video games that messed with their own source material, sometimes for the worse. Number 7. Die Hard Arcade. When you think of Die Hard, your mind might wander across images of tight vests, bloody feet, and a whole heap of happy trails, Hans. And for the most part, any video game based on this film trilogy is in keeping with these motifs. In the NES version, for example, there was even a foot health meter that was drained when you moved over glass, making McClane move slower. It's a nice touch, yes, but not a great game overall. The Die Hard trilogy, though, should be more familiar to many because it was a PS1 mainstay, combining third-person action game, on-rail shooter, and crazy taxi-esque bomb disposal in one title. It was actually pretty great, and at its core was on message with the film. Then we got Die Hard Arcade, a game so off base from its source that it's actually kind of mind-blowing. For a start, John isn't alone this time around, teaming up with Chris Thompson, who is actually the name of an editor who works here, to rescue the president's daughter, and who does so by beating the absolute crap out of all manner of ridiculous bosses, including but not limited to a biker gang leader and a Mexican luchador. It's actually a really fun game, but it's totally ridiculous when you look at how the license is handled. In fact, you could argue that it was like the developer modeled their original character on Bruce Willis, and that the studio got a whiff of this and slapped a license on it with little care as to how the franchise would tie in. Wait, what do you mean that's exactly what happened? Number 6. Dungeon Keeper. Greed is a horrible thing to witness in the video game industry, and it's reached an almost paradoxical level with some pockets of the community. Deep pockets, in fact, that prey on exploiting players with ugly microtransactions, or even worse, as the case of the Dungeon Master remake, by making them sink real money into a title to remove paywalls. There was a great deal of interest in the 1997 classic being given a new lease of life in 2014, because after all, this was a game that had garnered a cult following for its comedic approach to being the best bad guy in the dungeon building business. However, when the words free-to-play mobile game and EA came into the picture, well, it felt that all hope for the game was slowly being led to the gallows. This title effectively became a prison of its own design, making players stop in their tracks because they had run out of energy and had to either wait real-world time or bypass this frustration with real-world payments. It was an ugly game through and through that lost all of its charm and tone and replaced it instead with a literal devil telling you how great microtransactions are. Why do I feel like this is a portrait of the EA CEO? Someone was clearly having a laugh, but it wasn't anyone playing this, let me tell you. Number 5. Space Invaders Invasion Day. I honestly do not understand why this formula was messed with. I mean, sure, it's a game that has been around since the long ago, but that doesn't mean that the Space Invaders reboot that dropped in the early 2000s had to go the way it did. Now, the world at this point in time seemed obsessed with gritty reboots, and so now instead of pixel perfection, fans of the Space Invaders franchise got to shoot truly ugly renders of aliens in equally filthy-looking alleyways. Now, let it be known, I commend that they tried to do something with this game. Namely, they tried to add new characters, tried to add a bit more depth to the backstory, and tried the inclusion of bosses. Yet, its delivery fails in nearly every single one of these aspects. Why? Well, to borrow a parlance from Simon Miller, well, because basically none of these inclusions needed to be anywhere near this license, and as a result, Taito took an incredible and iconic concept and made it feel like a generic shooter with little to no soul. Plus, somehow the game's controls feel sluggish and unresponsive, which is a huge nail in a coffin for a game whose movement really only requires the player to be able to go left and right. When you have a game that can't nail its basics and then just mounts a ton of needless crap over the top, you have a clear example of a game that didn't know when to learn from its elders. Number 4. Alone in the Dark. While a lot is said about Resident Evil and Silent Hill's impact on and somewhat creation of the survival horror video game genre, not as much is said about the outstanding 1992 Alone in the Dark title, which still manages to elicit scares from its well-threaded tale of terror to this day. I mean, true, the graphics are a little funny by today's standards, but trust me, opening a door and finding this weird green zombie thing is still at the top of my childhood nightmares list. The series took an extended hiatus after 1994's Alone in the Dark 3, but when a reboot of sorts was announced in 2001, there was a huge resurgence of interest, with many hoping it to be a direct challenger to Resident Evil and Silent Hill. What we got though was an imitator of these titles rather than an innovator, whose gimmick of the narrative playing out like a TV show with recaps meant that the tale felt disconnected and padded out. Worse still, there was now a huge focus on action, and unlike the original game, which instilled fear by using enemies that couldn't be defeated, here it was just a case of beating down anything in your way. There were moments of brilliance, such as the use of a spreading fire mechanic, but all too often this would just mean that puzzles boiled down to light a match on this, or go take this flaming stick and shove it in that. Rubbish. It wasn't a terrible game, but it was clearly copying a lot of its selling points rather than remembering what made the original game so successful. Tightly constructed puzzles, enemies that required you to run rather than fight, and a lot less guff about possessed bodies and being the f***ing Lightbringer. Number 3, Bomberman Act 0. Another body on the pile of needlessly gritty reboots, the Bomberman of 2006 is so much of a black sheep to the rest of its family that it's not even the same bloody species. Ditching the outstanding, iconic and cutesy graphical stylings of the original games, along with any sense of fun, Act 0 is a horrible attempt to update a license that truly didn't need any of what was added. From the laughable techno-gothic leather look that somehow managed to over-sexualize what it even means to be a Bomberman, to its controls that felt like swimming through soup, nearly every aspect of this game failed to impress. Now, sometimes a reboot has to be drastic to drum up interest, but when you look at how companies like Nintendo managed to make cutesy art styles stay relevant, it becomes so apparent that the Bomberman reboot was just trying way too hard to capitalize on being cool. Bomberman, he ain't cool. Bomberman is fun. Bomberman is adorable. Bomberman actually controls like you bloody want him to. Therefore, by logical conclusion, Act 0 is not Bomberman and should be buried next to E.T. for how much it sucked. Number 2, Conker. Now, strangely enough, the resurrection of Conker for the HoloLens remains one of the only times that I can think of where a rebooted version of a character didn't get a darker and edgier update, as here, the red-furred and blue-mouthed squirrel was all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Now, admittedly, they did state that this was young Conker, which probably explains his more cutesy presentation, but at the same time, that's got to be one hell of a slip to go from this to the booze-soaked dolt that we got to witness on the N64. Now, to be fair, it's actually quite possible that the HoloLens itself led Conker to the drink, as while it wasn't an awful tech experiment, it was an absolutely bonkers call to use this guy as its focal selling point. Fans had come to love Conker for his inversion of the platforming genre, showcasing a lead that's selfish, aggressive, and rude into a game that on the surface appears cutesy and tame. Here, though, it was like all the personality had been stripped away, and all that we heard was a death knell being rung by Microsoft that called out, "Remember when we bought Rare? Well, look at your idols now." All they had to do was, well, literally the opposite of a youthful version in a non-platforming gimmicky experience that betrayed his very creation. It was like your mum trying to get into a serious drama role after appearing in Where's My Banana 4, oh yes, it's in my bumhole, in that the tone change was way too much for fans to handle. P.S. You will never guess where the banana was in her scene. And also, yes, that is my one per list. And number 1, PacMan on the Atari 2600. How do you mess this up so badly? Well, I guess for a start, you put all the programming duties onto just one man, give that man mere months to convert one of the biggest and best-selling arcade video games of all time, and have him do all of that on hardware that couldn't even power a calculator on today's mobile phones. Oh yeah, and then you pay him in advance to make more copies of the game than there are actual number of consoles able to play it on the market at that time, and you pay him 10 cents royalty on each copy, so you end up paying him a big fat check for the disaster of a game. Yeah, that's how. The fact that the PacMan game on the Atari 2600 couldn't even manage to get all of the ghosts on screen at once and had to use a flickering system to make it appear as though they were there is a testament of how much of a botched job this game was. It was greed incarnate to see this game rushed out for the holiday season, and even worse to see Atari market this game as, air quotes, a little different to the original once they realised what a state it was in. And there we go, those were 7 video games that messed with their own source material. Let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below, but before you go, my friends, I just want to say one thing. This list was about video games that messed up with their own source material, but you know what? Messing up is sometimes okay. Unlike these video games, you too can learn from your mistakes. That is a key thing to do. Don't just throw a ton of energy into a situation and hope for a different outcome, because chances are, unfortunately, it won't be. So take a step back, reevaluate what you can and can't control, and try to approach situations in a different light. And if you need help, remember you can ask for it. I know that it is difficult, but trust me, you will find that people care way more than you realise. As always, I've been Jules. You can go follow me at RetroJ with a 0 over on Twitter. And if you like gaming and stuff like that, then why not check out my other personal channel, Live and Let's Dice. It's all one word out there on YouTube, where it does board game channels and stuff like that. You might swing by and enjoy it. Roll a few bones with me, with the old man. As always, you have been awesome. Never forget that, and I'll speak to you soon.